Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're reading again today from Swiss Family Robinson, and today we're starting with chapter 47, Ostriches Again, A Hunt and a Capture, Acquisition of Treasure, Euphorbia, Vanilla. At the break of day, I was up and awoke my sons. Our labors were almost done. Our bear's meat was smoked, our fat all run out into bamboo vessels, and the rainy season, which was rapidly approaching, warned us to return to our home in the grotto. Nevertheless, I wished to make another excursion into the desert to see whether a second visit to the nest of ostrich eggs would not succeed better than the first, and I likewise wanted to gather some of the gum of the Euphorbia. As we wished to accomplish this excursion as rapidly as possible, it was resolved to go on horseback. We took with us Turk and Billy and set off following the direction of the Green Valley, tracing over again all the places rendered illustrious by some remembrance of our last excursion. The spot where we had encountered the bears, the turtle marsh, and at last the rock from which Fritz discovered the ostriches. To this rock we gave the name of Arab's Tower in allusion to the mistake he had made in thinking the ostriches to be Arabs of the desert. Jack and Francis galloped off at full speed, and as the plain was so level that they could not escape from my eye, I let them go on. I retained Fritz by my side to aid me in gathering the euphorbia which had congealed in the sun. I had provided myself with a vessel to put it in, and I soon filled it with the little drops of hardened gum. This gum is one of the most violent and subtle poisons, and my son asked me why I took so much pains to collect it. I intend to use it, said I, to destroy the monkeys, a cruel means, I will allow, but necessity drives us to adopt it. We can also employ the euphorbia in preparing the skins of birds and other animals. It will preserve them from corruption and keep out all insects. To whatever use, however, we may apply it, the greatest precaution must be observed, as it is capable of producing the most dreadful results. During our work, the two cavaliers had almost disappeared in the savannah, and it was with great difficulty that our eyes could follow them, surrounded as they were by a cloud of dust. They had passed far beyond the ostrich nest, to which we directed our course, wishing to see whether the eggs had been abandoned or not. We had scarcely come in sight of the nest when we saw 4 noble ostriches rise from the sand and advance toward us. Fritz's first care was to prepare his eagle for the conflict, and to prevent it from renewing the former scene of carnage, he fastened its beak so strongly that it was almost harmless. Our dogs were also muzzled, and we stood still in order that we might not frighten the birds. On they came, with half-extended wings, gliding over the ground with inconceivable rapidity. They seemed to think us inanimate objects, for they came on directly for us until they had arrived within pistol shot. There were 3 females and a male, the last a little in advance, with his beautiful tail feathers floating behind him. The moment of attack had come. I seized my string with balls, and calling up all my sleight of hand, I launched it against the male ostrich. Unfortunately, however, instead of catching him around the legs, as I intended, the balls of my string took a turn round his body, and I only fastened his wings to his sides. It diminished his speed somewhat, but the victory was not complete, and the frightened bird turned round, and using his long legs, endeavored to escape. Away we dashed after him, I on the onagra and Fritz on the colt, but we were nearly exhausted when happily Jack and Francis rode up and cut off his further retreat. Fritz then unhooded his eagle, and pointing out the ostrich to him, he immediately pounced upon his prey, and now commenced an arduous chase. Jack and Francis on one side, and Fritz and I on the other, tormented him and harassed him without ceasing, but the most useful combatant was the eagle. Excuse me. The presence of this new enemy troubled the ostrich greatly. He felt him on his head and heard the flapping of its wings, while on the other hand, the eagle, furious at finding his beak strongly fastened by a ligature of cotton, was so violent that by a vigorous stroke of his wings, the ostrich fairly tottered. Jack then threw his string and balls so skillfully that the noble bird bit the sand of the desert. A cry of joy burst from the huntsman. The eagle was recalled and hoodwinked, and we hastened to our prize in order to prevent his breaking the bonds that confined him, for he was so very violent and struggled so vigorously that I hardly dared to approach him. I imagined that by depriving him of light I might reduce his fury, and I threw my hunting sack, my vest, and handkerchief over his head. I had discovered the secret. No sooner were his eyes covered than he became as quiet as a lamb. I approached, passed a large band of sea-dog skin round his body. 2 other bands were attached as rein to each side, and his legs were fastened with strong cords long enough to allow him to walk, but which confined him sufficiently to prevent his escape. I then attached our 2 coursers before and behind the ostrich with strong cords, and when all was ready, my 2 cavaliers jumped into their saddles, and I pulled the covering from the head of the ostrich. The bird remained some time immovable, as if astonished at the return of light. It soon made a start, but the ropes pulled it roughly back and it fell down on its knees. Again it made the attempt, and again it was foiled. It tried to fly. Excuse me. I'm sorry. It tried to fly, but its wings were tightly fastened by the band I had passed around them. Its legs were also restrained. It threw itself from side to side with the utmost violence, but the patient buffaloes did not pay the least attention to the pulling and hauling. At last, the bird appeared convinced of the inutility of its efforts, and submitting to its two companions, set off with them at full gallop. They dashed gallantly on for half an hour until the buffalo and the bull, less accustomed to the sands of the savannah than the ostrich, forced it to abate its rapid pace and adopt a slower system of movement. While the two young cavaliers were thus occupied, Fritz and I set out in search of the ostrich nest. The cross of willows which we had planted in the ground near it at our last visit was still remained, and as we approached, a female bird rose up off the nest and flew rapidly away into the desert. Her presence appeared to us a good augury, as it assured us that the eggs still retained the principle of life. I had taken care to bring with me a sack and a quantity of cotton. I now took out 6 of the eggs, and enveloping them as carefully as possible in the cotton, placed them in the sack, leaving the others in the nest in hopes the mother would not discover the theft. We traversed the green valley without perceiving anything uncommon, and soon arrived at the tent where Ernest and his mother received us with an astonishment they could not find words to express. I fastened the ostrich securely between 2 trees, and the rest of the day was devoted to preparations for our departure on the morrow. We had a number of new riches to collect, and I wished to leave nothing behind us. The next day we set off early. The ostrich took his place between the bull and the buffalo as before. He was at first inclined to be refractory and threw himself from right to left, but all in vain. His 2 conductors were like immovable masses against which all resistance was unavailing. Fritz mounted the young colt Rapid, and I the onagra, while Ernest directed the car, in the middle of which my wife sat in all her majesty among the provisions. Our march was slow, but it was very picturesque, as may be imagined. We halted at the entrance of the defile, where my sons had suspended the cord with the feathers attached to keep back the antelopes and gazelles. In the place of the cord, we erected a solid palisade of bamboo, high enough to keep out all animals that do not climb. We planted a row of thorn bushes on each side and sprinkled a layer of sand all around so that we could discover what sort of animals might frequent it. During the construction of this fence, we made a new discovery. It was that of the vanilla bean, which I recognized by its brown pods and balsamic odor. Our labors at the defile detained us a long time, and it was night when we arrived at the cabin of the hermitage. We found our smoking hut the same as before, and our provision of peccary untouched. We lighted a fire, and after a frugal repast, extended ourselves on our sacks of cotton and courted balmy sleep. The next day, we discovered a new treasure. Our hen house had received an addition of 20 young chicks, the product of the eggs Jack had brought home in his hat. My wife was enchanted at this discovery and caught several pairs to take home with her. We were so anxious to return to our dear Felsenheim and to resume all our comforts and luxuries that we resolved not to stop again until we arrived there. It was long after noon when our weary journey was finished. We were worn out with fatigue. The sun's rays had been pouring down on our heads all day, and our strength was so exhausted we could scarcely give our animals their evening food. Chapter 48. Progress in Ostrich Discipline, Efficacy of Tobacco Smoke, Hydromel, the New Hat, Pottery. The day after our arrival at Felsenheim, my wife commenced cleaning house. Windows were opened, beds aired, and all swept and garnished. While she and the 2 younger boys were thus employed, I, with the 2 elder, unpacked and distributed the riches we had brought home. We had tied the ostrich at first under a tree and securely fastened his feet, but we changed his situation and tied him to one of the strong bamboo columns that supported the gallery. We next visited the eggs, and they were, like the first, submitted to the trial of warm water. Several of them fell heavily to the bottom. But 3 or 4 moved slightly when immersed in the water, and these were carefully preserved in order that we might try the experiment of hatching them by cotton and artificial heat. For this purpose, I constructed an oven in which I took care to maintain that degree of heat which the thermometer marked as being the natural heat of the hen. We then installed our Angora rabbits on Shark Island. We constructed a burrow in the ground, similar to those of Europe, and putting them in, we combed them and removed all the superfluous hair. We also fixed wooden combs over the entrance of each burrow so that the rabbits, when passing in or out, would be deprived of some part of their fine wool, which I intended to manufacture into hats. The 2 antelopes were also transported to Shark Island. We should have liked very much to keep these charming little creatures about us, but the fear of the dogs and beasts of prey forced us to condemn the timid creatures to confinement. In order to render their exile as agreeable as possible, I erected a hut in the middle of the island to shelter them, and we took good care to provide them with plenty of provisions. I wished, before the rains came on, to prepare a field to receive the seeds we had hitherto confided to the earth without any order or regularity. It was a difficult enterprise, and we felt in all its reality the force of that law which condemned man to gain his bread by the sweat of his brow. Our faithful animals were of much assistance to us, but the sun was so intense that the slightest labor utterly exhausted them. We could work but 4 hours in the day, 2 in the morning and 2 in the evening. We were able, however, to prepare at last about 2 acres of land, which would furnish us an ample harvest of maize, potatoes, and manioc root. During the intervals of our fatiguing field labors, we occupied ourselves by beginning the education of the ostrich. It was an enterprise as difficult as it was novel, but I had read that it could be accomplished, and I was resolved to try it. Our pupil began by putting himself in a terrible passion. He struggled, snapped at us with his beak, and cut up all sorts of capers. But we could find no better remedy for such conduct than to treat him as we had treated Fritz's eagle, that was, by burning tobacco under his nose. This had the desired effect, and we soon saw the majestic bird totter and fall insensible to the ground. We had recourse to this plan several times. Little by little, we relaxed the cord which fastened it to the bamboo post and gave it room to wander about the doorway. A litter of rushes was provided for him. Calabashes filled with sweet nuts, rice, maize, and guavas were placed every day before the animal. In a word, we neglected nothing that we thought would consort with the fellow's tastes. During 3 days, all our cares were in vain. Our choice dishes were regarded with great disdain. The beautiful captive would not eat, and it carried its obstinacy so far that at last I was seriously afraid of the consequences. At last an idea occurred to my wife which relieved us all from embarrassment. It was to poke down the throat of the bird, willy-nilly, balls of maize and butter. The ostrich made horrible faces at first, but when it got a taste of the balls, all trouble on that point was over, and the delicacies we placed before it were quickly devoured, the guavas, by the by, being especially favored. The natural savageness of the bird disappeared more and more every day. It would let us approach it without striking us, and after some days we thought we could, without much risk, unfasten it to take a short lesson in the art of walking. We placed it between the buffalo and the bull and put it through all the exercises of the stable: to trot, to gallop, stop short, trot again, walk slow, etc. I cannot say that the poor bird relished his first lesson very much, but the tobacco pipe and the whip were 2 admirable instructors, and when he was disposed to become unruly, a whiff of tobacco would set all to rights. At the end of the month, its education was complete, and it had so well succeeded that I now seriously thought of making our new conquest of general usefulness. I wished it to associate with our domestic animals, to submit like them to regular movements, and to stop and march as we wished. The first thing that was to be thought of was a bit. But how could I contrive a bit for a beak? I had never seen one, and I must confess that I felt greatly embarrassed. At last I achieved my task. I had remarked that the absence of light was a very direct influence upon the ostrich. It would stop short when blindfolded, and could not be induced to move until its eyes were uncovered. This discovery was the basis of the new invention that I constructed. I made with the skin of a sea dog a sort of hood, like the one we had made for the eagle, which covered the head, being fastened about the neck. I made 2 openings in the side of this hood, one opposite each eye, and covered each of these holes with one of our little turtle shells, attached to a whalebone spring, fixed in such a manner that it would open and shut. Reins were fastened to these springs so that by their action we could admit the light or shut it out just as we pleased. When the 2 shells were opened, the ostrich galloped straight on. When one was opened, it went in a direction corresponding with the eye that received light, and when both shells were shut, it would stop short. The most fully trained horse could not have obeyed better than our ostrich did under his novel headdress. My children thought that the education of our captive was now complete, but I was of a different opinion. The ostrich is a very robust animal and capable of supporting a great deal of fatigue. I wished it to learn to carry burdens, to draw a carriage, and be adapted for horsemanship. I began consequently to make harness for each of these occupations. We had a great deal of difficulty in making the ostrich submit to our wishes. Our hardest task was to make it submit to our mounting it, but I knew that patience and perseverance are the first two elements of success in imparting education. I was not therefore discouraged, and at last we had the satisfaction to see our new courser galloping between Felsenheim and Falcon's Nest with one of our young cavaliers mounted on his back. The artificial nest of ostrich eggs, which we had enveloped in cotton and placed in a stove, had succeeded. That is to say, out of 6 eggs, 3 had hatched. The young ostriches were the drollest-looking animals that could be imagined. They looked like ducks, mounted on long legs, and they tottered awkwardly about on their slender stilts. One died the day after its birth. The 2 others survived, and we endeavored to preserve them by taking all possible care for their comfort. Maize, acorns, boiled rice, milk, and cassava were set before them in rich profusion. We had had nothing to drink but water since our arrival on the island, if I except the barrel of Cape wine that we had saved from the shipwreck. But that had long ago been exhausted, and I now determined to make some sort of drink for the winter. Excuse me. I had often heard of the hydromel of the Russians. We had the primary material, honey, from our hives, and I determined to make the experiment. We boiled some honey in a sufficient quantity of water, and after having filled 2 barrels with the fluid, I threw in a large cake of sour cornbread to make the liquor ferment. When that process was finished, we tasted it and found it was of a pleasant flavor, agreeably acid, and a great resource for our long winter days. We placed the 2 tons in our cellar, or, to speak more justly, in the hole we had dignified by that name. We then set to work and made a choicer drink than the first. To our honey and water we added nutmegs, ravensara, and in short, a collection of all the aromatic plants we could find. This drink was reserved for extraordinary occasions such as holiday banquets, anniversaries, etc. When all our provisions were gathered in and we felt sure that we could get through the winter without famine overtaking us, we commenced our manufacture of hats. It was a labor as difficult as novel for us. The first question that presented itself was the form of our hats. Each one gave in his opinion, but necessity came into the council, and obliged us to give our new manufacture the form most in unison with our means of execution. It was extremely simple. I cut a wooden head, which divided into 2 parts, and on which we spread a thick layer of soft paste, composed of rat skin and the glue of fishes. We let it dry, and as it took the exact impress of the mold, we obtained a sort of cap, of which my readers can form some idea of the shape. It had cost us a great deal of trouble to produce even this ill-looking affair. My sons were scarcely less satisfied with it than I was, but our European hats were so dilapidated that it became a matter of necessity to procure something to replace them. I now had recourse to the cochineal, and I soon gave to our beaver a beautiful, brilliant purple tint. The hat looked better. I adorned it with a couple of ostrich plumes, and it looked better still. My wife passed a ribbon around it, which she had found in her enchanted sack, and the disdain with which my poor beaver had been received was changed into anxious requests for its possession. But its destination had been fixed beforehand. It belonged to Francis by right, as he had lost his old hat a few days before. Our success in the manufacture of hats emboldened us to try our hand at other things. We were much in want of kitchen utensils, and I was obliged to pass from the art of hat-making to that of potter. I did not understand much about pottery, and what puzzled me most was the way in which the earth was to be prepared before using it, and I began my experiments with very little hope of their ever succeeding. I constructed, in one corner of the grotto, a large stove divided into compartments destined to receive the different articles. Earthen pipes were conducted all around so as to equalize the heat as much as possible. These preparations occupied me a long time, as I had no idea how the thing should be done, and I can safely say I invented rather than imitated a furnace for pottery. I next took a certain quantity of the porcelain earth, which very much resembled fine white sand. I carefully removed all foreign particles, such as bits of stone, etc., as I was afraid they would cut our hands while working the porcelain. I also mixed a quantity of the talc we had brought home for window panes, thinking perhaps it would render the mixture more firm and solid. When all was well worked up together, I left it a little while to dry while I set to work to invent a machine for turning our utensils on. The wheel of one of our cannon carriages, fixed horizontally on a pivot and surmounted by another wheel, united to it by an axle and turning with it, formed my machine. I first turned out some plates and dishes, cups and saucers, bowls, and other things. I exposed these articles to a very strong heat, a great many broken pieces, but I completed about half. When baked, they were perfectly transparent and of the most beautiful grain. My wife saw her kitchen apparatus enriched with utensils of all sorts, and overwhelmed with joy, she promised us in exchange numberless good dainties which, for want of a suitable utensil, she had hitherto been unable to make. Chapter 49. Return of the Rainy Season, a New Want, the Cajack. The rainy season was now rapidly approaching, and we were soon obliged to give up our excursions. Excuse me. The winds and the rain commenced. The sky that had so long been clear became dark with storm clouds. Terrible tempests announced the approach of winter, and we closed the door of our grotto, happy in having such a comfortable shelter. The turning wheel was continually in motion. We improved the quality of our fabrications more and more, and we manufactured utensils that at the outset we had despaired of ever possessing. We had preserved the shells of the ostrich eggs, and having divided them by means of a string steeped in vinegar, we converted the halves into elegant vases. I turned some wooden pedestals on which they were placed, and we thus obtained drinking cups and vases for flowers in summer. But these labors were much more interesting to me than to my young family, and I feared that the inactivity to which I saw them reduced would render them indolent. Excuse me. Ernest found occupation enough in his books, but his brothers never entered the library unless when driven by necessity. I felt the urgency of providing some active occupation for them, and one more to their taste in literature, but I could not think of anything when Fritz came to my assistance. "We have," said he, "in the person of our ostrich, a splendid post-horse with which to travel the highways of our kingdom. We have carts to transport our provisions, a pinnace and a canoe which are riding majestically at anchor in Safety Bay, but one thing is yet wanting. We have need of an equipage that will glide over the surface of the water as the ostrich does over the sand. I have read that the Greenlanders have a sort of vessel which they call Cajack, and which I must have. Why cannot we construct one? We have constructed a canoe. Why should we, civilized Europeans, not succeed in that which barbarous savages have attempted?" I joyfully received the proposition of my son. The Cajack, the only vessel of the Greenlander, is a sort of canoe in the form of a shell, and a piece of walrus skin with 3 or 4 strips of whalebone are almost the only requisites for its construction. It is extremely light, and the navigator who has glided in it over the surface of the wave can easily carry it on his shoulder when he has arrived at land. The strips of whalebone, bamboo cane, and Spanish rushes with some sea dog skin were the materials that we employed in making our Cajack. 2 arched strips of whalebone fastened at each end and separated in the middle by a piece of bamboo fixed transversely across formed the 2 sides of our canoe. Other pieces of whalebone, woven in with rushes and moss, well covered with pitch, formed the skeleton. When the skeleton was finished and the interior covered with a coat of gum and moss, we commenced the construction of an envelope. For this, I took the 2 entire skins of sea calves, fastened one at each end of the canoe, and then drew them down under it, where they were strongly sewed together and covered with a gum elastic coat to render them impervious to water. I also cut out oars of bamboo and fastened bladders to one end so that they might be useful in case of accident. I also constructed in the bow a place to receive a sail in case we should decide at a future period to put one there. There was yet an important thing wanting in the completion of our Greenland boat. It was the equipment of him who was to manage it. I had often heard of a sort of apparel well known to those who dwell near the sea, and which consisted in enveloping a person in an airtight dress, lighter than the volume of liquid his body displaced. I described this apparel to my sons, narrated to them how the head of the swimmer was covered with a hood, furnished with a pipe intended to let in air when it was necessary to breathe under water. My description of the costume and the air chimney fairly turned the boys' heads, and they would not rest night or day until they persuaded me to ask their mother to construct such a suit for them. My good Elizabeth, to whom our desires were as laws, kindly undertook the work, and so nimbly did her needle ply that in a few days she had made a complete swimming costume for Fritz. A jacket of the skin of the whale's entrails, hermetically sealed and sewed around the borders so that the air could not possibly escape, was furnished with a flexible pipe closed with a valve so that it could be inflated or exhausted at the pleasure of its wearer. The winter had glided insensibly away. Reading, the study of languages, and other literary pursuits had been mingled with our domestic avocations, and helped to render the gloomy days we passed in the grotto more pleasant and agreeable. But our emancipation from the grotto was approaching. The wind calmed, the sea resumed its wonted placidity, the grass sprang up under our feet, and we revisited Falcon's Nest with its giant trees and its rich harvest of springing grain. The swimming costume was the last thing that we had made, and Fritz was anxious to make a trial of it. Consequently, one fine afternoon, dinner over, he put on his jacket, which was drawn close round his neck. Then his hood, with its pipe for air, was fitted to the jacket, and 2 pieces of talc inserted in such a manner as to enable him to see. Our first movement on seeing him thus accounted was to burst into a fit of laughter. But Fritz plunged gravely into the water and struck out for Shark Island. We followed him in the canoe and arrived at about the same time. We unfastened his hood and found that not a particle of water had penetrated it. Everyone was rejoiced at the success of the experiment, and we all persuaded our kind mother to make us one each. We then set off to explore the island and endeavor to discover what had become of the colony we had planted there. Our first visit was to the Antelopes. They fled at our approach, but we saw with pleasure that they had devoured all the provisions we had provided them with. We strewed some rushes in their little hut for a litter, and after renewing the stock of provisions, left the spot so that the timid animals could return. My sons and I wandered over the island, gathering pieces of coral and beautiful shells to adorn our museum. A second excursion to Shark Island gave us leisure to examine the different plantations we had made. They had succeeded admirably, and we found several young trees already some feet above the ground. Our rabbits had also prospered, and the family had increased to an enormous extent. We made, too, a short excursion to Whale Island. Our plantations here had also succeeded. All was prosperity around us. Our maritime possessions and those on terra firma afforded a most agreeable spectacle to the eyes of the proprietors. Abundance, richness, and a luxuriant vegetation gave promise of an excellent harvest. One day, when I was occupied by my domestic cares in the interior of the grotto, 3 of my sons disappeared without saying anything. They carried with them their arms, provisions, and a number of rat traps. The latter easily explained the secret of their expedition. They had gone for rat skins in order to make some new hats. I wished them good luck and thought nothing more of the matter. Ernest, always fond of home, had remained reading in the library. My wife was occupied in the kitchen, and I resolved to imitate my sons and attempt an excursion alone. I had need of some large blocks of wood with which to grind the grain we had gathered, but I would not cut down one of the trees around our habitation for fear of disfiguring our residence. I went to the stable for a horse, but all except the buffalo had disappeared, and I was obliged to be content with him. I soon fastened him to the sledge, and we set off in company in the direction of the Jackal's River. I took with me Phoebe and Brawn. The faithful Billy remained with Ernest, and Turk had gone off in the morning with his young masters. My intention in choosing the river road was that in passing I might take a look at our plantations of manioc and potatoes which extended along its bank. I had not seen this land, which we had prepared with a great deal of trouble, for 4 months prior, and I expected to find an abundant harvest preparing for us. Judge, then, of my surprise on approaching to find the whole plantation a scene of ruin. The roots that had just begun to sprout were all trodden underfoot or scattered over the ground. In a word, it was a scene of utter desolation. I thought at first that perhaps my sons had gathered the harvest, but the prints in the moist earth soon revealed the authors of this devastation. It had been done either by the wild pigs or else by the family of our old sow. My brave companions, Phoebe and Brawn, had gone off in search of the despoilers, and they soon returned, driving before them a whole herd of pigs, at the head of which trotted our old sow, grunting most melodiously. I was so irritated at the unlucky animals that almost instinctively I raised my gun and by a single shot brought down 2 young porkers. The others took to flight, and the dogs would have pursued them, but I called them back, and cutting off the heads of the 2 pigs, gave them to them. I then placed the bodies on the sledge, and having marked with a hatchet the trees I had chosen, so that I should know them again, I set off for Felsenheim with a saddened heart at the devastation I had witnessed. We'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 50. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.